So Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, in few corners of this country will you find that racism is not broadly stigmatized, let alone in a county that preferred the first black president by a 9-point margin. Wausau, Wisconsin is a working-class Midwestern city located in a classic forgotten man district, one represented by a Democrat for decades, friendly to Obama, friendly to the Tea Party, then friendly to Trump. A city with a median income well below the state average and a beautiful slice of the Wisconsin River running right through it. New York Times reporter Reed Epstein, who worked formerly for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, parachuted into Wausau recently to highlight a contentious local debate for his national audience. You'll be surprised to learn he found what he was looking for, a backwards community full of ignorant reactionaries and their victims. A community for all. Not so fast, this Wisconsin county says, the New York Times headline sneered. The racial divisiveness that President Donald J. Trump stoked during his 4 years in the White House endures in the daily life of towns like Wausau, Epstein wrote, reporting on a tense Marathon County board meeting last month. At issue was a fairly innocuous resolution declaring the county, quote, a community for all, that inspired strong responses from both sides, likely because it's peppered with charged jargon like equity that is common sense to the left and Marxist to the right. In his copy, Epstein was sure to include a lecture on the correct Ivy League certified interpretation of equity, writing that the word, quote, served as a trigger for many who made the false claim that memorializing it as a goal would lead to the counties taking things from white people to give them to people of color. You can do that when you have a journalism degree from Columbia, I suppose. According to Epstein, quote, those opposed to the resolution made far-reaching claims about its potential impact. Now, he had no similar concerns about claims from proponents of the bill that its failure would precipitate, quote, economic calamity. The whole article depicts a scene out of Parks and Recreation with enlightened progressives locked in a righteous battle with conspiracy-addled right-wing rubes hopped up on Hannity. It's shoddy journalism because its opinion laundered into the discourse as objective news, but also because it's wrong, and it's wrong in a very telling way. Marathon County was home to a tiny town named Brokaw until 2018. Brokaw no longer exists. Its 250 inhabitants were absorbed into a neighboring town after its last paper mill closed in 2012, eliminating 450 jobs and bankrupting Brokaw. Some people, including a former executive and bipartisan coalition of senators, blame the involvement of a New York hedge fund. Did they have control of the mill? Absolutely not. Did they direct the actions of the company? Absolutely not. Did they create the conditions that led to the closure of the mill? Yes. That's from Hank Newell of Wausau Paper, and he told that to the Washington Post in 2018. This whole situation inspired the Brokaw Act from Wisconsin's Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin that was co-sponsored by former Georgia Republican Senator David Perdue. Now, whatever level of involvement you believe the hedge fund had in Brokaw's death, there's also increasing competition from China and rapid technological changes to blame for the shifting economic landscape in Marathon County, which produces nearly all of America's ginseng. Although, quote, most of that production has been lost to Canada and China since the 1990s, according to the local CBS affiliate. So why is the county board mired in a fight about diversity and equity? Why is that so animating to voters? Racism is everywhere. Even in Wausau, a predominantly white city that has for decades welcomed Hmong refugees fleeing communist violence after the Vietnam War, to the point where the Hmong now account for about 10% of Wausau's population. It's really a beautiful American story. Not a perfect one, but beautiful nonetheless. The most poignant excerpt from Epstein's dispatch in the Times was a quote. I don't have the same type of confidence or faith in the community like I used to, a 39-year-old of Hmong descent who said her support for the resolution triggered death threats, told the Times. I was born and raised here, and I don't recognize the community that I grew up in right now. That's a minority, millennial proponent of the resolution saying the same thing many of its white boomer opponents would say, that she doesn't recognize the community she grew up in. I don't blame the hedge fund for the county board blow-up. I blame our leaders for normalizing unpatriotic economics in the interest of their own bank accounts, and Silicon Valley for facilitating the gamification of our discourse, getting rich off our addictions and divisions. And I blame legacy media outlets like the New York Times for making all of it worse, for smearing decent people who disagree with elite opinion, making the predatory work of Silicon Valley even easier. The resolution, which ultimately lost, was initially named No Place for Hate. Do New York Times readers understand why weird academic jargon that implicates the county in racism might offend a community that opened its arms and its heart to a massive influx of refugees and helped elect the first black president? I certainly understand why younger residents of the predominantly white county, conditioned to see racial strife everywhere, are starting to feel targeted when they didn't previously, and why resentment is now building on both sides of this small community. The road to recovery is not through shoddy and contemptuous parachute journalism that just keeps blaming Trump for local racial divisions. It's about admitting cultural and economic anxieties are intertwined, and more importantly, admitting those anxieties are often reasonable, not categorically reactionary. Trump is a symptom, not a cause. If you don't get that by now, you have no business reporting on any of this. By the way, I live here in DC because I grew up in Wisconsin and hated the way we were depicted by the media. I wanted to help change that however I could. So yes, this is personal, but it's personal for a whole lot of other people too. Elites in academia, media, and business want more debates over equity. The rest of us just want to feed our families and get along. Those two goals are not compatible in this fraught cultural climate. Ryan, a little bit of a mouthful there. What do you make of Epstein's dispatch in the Times, where he sort of zoomed into this local county board meeting? And I do think this resolution was fairly innocuous. It did have words like equity in it, and I can understand why that would offend some people in the community. But do you think Epstein really captured the true dynamics on the ground in Marathon County, Wisconsin? Or do you think there's still this element of sort of injecting the broader narrative about racial divisions in this country that are still, being stoked by Donald Trump into the story?
Well, I think it's actually really hard now to define what's authentic anymore, and what's actually regional, what's actually local, and separate it from social media and from these broader narratives, because everybody now is online, or they are being influenced by these debates that are online. I mean, where else does a resolution like this come from? Whose idea was this? It's not exactly. It's obviously it came from people who live there, but it's not an organic idea to this town. It kind of comes from the ether, comes from the social media ether, comes from down on high, and those little debates are happening, and everybody's mentions all over Twitter, and they're also now leaking out into the real world, because I think it's a lot easier for both camps to kind of talk about this issue than it is for them to talk about what the hedge fund did to their community and what they're going to do to respond to that.
Right, and that's the people that run hedge funds, by the way, and that run the New York Times would much rather us be talking about equity and about critical race theory than talking about the hedge funds and by talking about the New York Times business model. They would much rather have us just be sort of bogged down by that conversation because it distracts from what they're actually doing. And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way, but I mean that in the way that they're able to sort of, do what they're doing and get clicks off of outrage, which is really easily generated on some of these cultural issues, while they just get to keep doing what they're doing on the economic issues, and people just are looking the other way because they are rightfully angry about this blow up like something like this.
And arguing about who was right about the resolution feels like a sucker's game, because then you've been pulled into this debate, which not necessarily designed by the people who are doing it, but produced by the system to distract you from what's actually going on and what's actually destroying people's lives in this town. And if the advocates of the resolution and the opponents of it wanted to come to some agreement over language that condemned bad things, that all of them agreed are bad, and all of them do agree are bad. Even in this town in Wisconsin, everybody's going to agree that racism is bad. That love is good, welcoming people is good, that it should be a place for everybody. if the advocates of the resolution could have compromised on some language, I'm sure they could get there, but maybe nobody wanted to hear it on the other side, because it just becomes a proxy for where you stand on this culture war. And like you said, it's that the hedge funders are laughing all the way to the bank.
Yeah, and that's the thing that drives me absolutely nuts. And that's why I started the radar by saying, you're not going to find a lot of corners of this country where racism is not broadly stigmatized. And I stand by that. And that's what's so sad about these situations, is that both sides feel that they need to dig in. And I do not blame them, because these are serious issues. Absolutely. But at the heart of this, I mean, if we all had a healthier sort of economic condition in some of these, particularly in some of these places where there's alienation, and that's, by the way, pretty much everywhere now, thanks to Silicon Valley, but in some places it's worse than others. If we were talking about that, I think we would all be a lot happier, and we could just sort of get on with our lives and enjoy our neighbors more. But Ryan, I'm very much looking forward to your radar next.